Puppets. What is it about them that creates such an unsettling atmosphere? I'm sure many of us had a particular puppet or doll that tormented us growing up, always worried that it might come to life and do something. This fear comes from their uncanny valley factor, and the fact that they are only able to move when we're in control of them. So the thought of them moving on their own creates an unsettling feeling. And there are many puppet shows on television that enhance this fear, whether they intend to or not. So today, we're going to be taking a peek behind the curtains at 10 of the most disturbing puppet shows from around the world.
The BJ and Dirty Dragon Show. The BJ and Dirty Dragon Show aired from 1968 to 1974 and starred Bill Jackson, the BJ of the show, and his many puppets. The show spun off from Jackson's first series, Clown Alley, which was widely praised but did poorly due to having a bad time slot. The studios were impressed with him though, and gave him a second chance with the BJ and Dirty Dragon Show, bringing along some of his most popular puppets. Jackson played himself as the mayor of Cartoon Town, which despite its name, had puppets as its residents. Dirty Dragon was the postmaster, but ended up eating all the mail. At the center of the town was a large blob clay that spoke in a distorted voice that only Jackson could understand. He would manipulate the blob into whatever shape he felt was appropriate for that day. The show received tough competition, forcing the studio to make a few alterations to the format, including turning the puppet characters into human actors in costumes. This didn't sit well with audiences though, and it was changed back to puppets quickly. It's easy to imagine why the puppets wouldn't work well as human-sized costumes since they were terrifying to look at in puppet form. Imagine that blown up a few sizes and moving far too human-like. The puppets' facial features were all grossly exaggerated in order to create a comedic effect. Many of the puppets' faces are static, retaining their deformed expressions throughout their entire appearance on screen, speaking roles and all. Despite the ugly and disturbing appearances of some of the puppets, Bill Jackson and his shows received critical acclaim around the Chicago area and even held one final show in 2009 at the Museum of Broadcast Communications.
Les Minicams. Les Minicams was a French children's puppet show that aired from 1993 until 2002. The show was immensely successful in France, even leading to a massive fan base that is still active to this day. And to be honest, I don't know why. The Minicam puppets are very uncomfortable to look at. They're very similar to Lazy Town. The puppets are very stylized, mixed in with a sense of realism. They look as though they were drawn as cartoon characters first and then made into puppets later, similar to what Brad Bird did with The Incredibles. However, these puppets were given realistic looking features on top of their cartoonish appearances, like lips, skin textures, and eyelids. The end result is something that looks very uncanny. In 2017, the overwhelming demand of the Minicams media caused the franchise to be rebooted, where it is currently airing to this day. The show must be pretty popular for some reason, but it can't be argued that the puppets are pretty creepy.
The Spooks of Bottle Bay. The Spooks of Bottle Bay was a British children's drama series that aired from 1993 to 1995. 3 VHS tapes were released featuring a few episodes, but no DVD release or video upload exists for the remaining episodes, and there hasn't been any airing of the series on television since. The show follows the adventures of Sidney Sludge and his dog Maxwell inside of a ship in a bottle, while coming across his evil siblings, Sybil and Cedric. Each time he is helped, unbeknownst to him, by the spooks of Bottle Bay. In terms of what makes the show unsettling, the puppets seem to be a sort of hybrid between the style seen in Les Minicams and Lazy Town, and a more abstract style similar to the BJ and Dirty Dragon Show. While a good amount of the series currently remains lost, it appears that some viewers have been trading early recordings, so it's possible there may be more of this series to be seen in the future.
A Scared Bedtime. A Scared Bedtime, also known as Podge and Raj, was an Irish puppet show that aired from 1997 until 2006, almost 10 years. The name of the show was a sort of pun on a show called A Prayer at Bedtime, which overlaid the text of a Roman Catholic prayer over serene images while choral music played. The show follows a pair of twins in their 60s, Raj and Podge, who lived in a converted insane asylum with a lunatic nurse named Granny, who's dating Satan. This is clearly very different from the plethora of unintentionally disturbing children's shows that have made up this list so far. The series is full of dark and sexual humor, especially with Raj, who makes frequent masturbation jokes. Podge and Raj are rather ugly, with large bulging eyes and gross, pasty skin. This makes sense though, given that their last names are O'Leprosy. The show is no stranger to gross out humor, with on-screen vomited and other crude jokes. Given that this show is aimed at adults and teenagers, it makes sense that this puppet show would embrace the more disturbing and weird elements that come with the territory. The fact that most of this was intentional takes away a bit from the unsettling factor that's present with many of these children's puppet shows. But it still belongs on this list nonetheless for its use of these ugly-ass puppets.
Tots TV. Produced in Britain by Ragdoll Productions, the show focused on 3 children who went on standard children's adventures, such as going to the pool or picking apples. Like most of the shows on this list, it's ultimately harmless. But it's the look of the puppets that really seals the deal in terms of creepiness. They appear rather static and lifeless, aside from the obvious clacky-looking eyes and barely moving mouths. They look like a crossbreed between Raggedy Ann and the Cabbage Patch Kids. Interestingly, one of the 3 children, Tilly, is voiced completely in French.
Madame, les fenêtres sont sales.
In the French version, she speaks English, and in the American version, she speaks in Spanish. Aside from that, there's really nothing else setting this apart from other puppet shows though. It's just another unintentionally creepy children's show. Except this time with stringy straw hair and beady little eyes.
Mr. Meaty. You all knew Mr. Meaty would be on here, so let's just dive straight in. This Canadian-American teen comedy originally aired on CBC Television in Canada and Nickelodeon in America. It follows 2 teenagers, Parker and Josh, who work at Mr. Meaty, a fast food restaurant in the mall. Not only do the puppets themselves look pretty disturbing, but the content in the show is also pretty messed up as well. There's of course the infamous tapeworm episode where Parker gets a tapeworm after eating raw meat, leading them to sell it to a zookeeper who just straight up eats it.
That's the stuff!
But there are far more messed up moments than just that. One example is the recurring character Mr. Carney, the 109-year-old founder and CEO of Mr. Meaty. He cryogenically froze himself in order to prolong his life, and now he appears so sickly and diseased that he could very well be a zombie. Aside from his looks, he's a rather disturbing individual, forcing his assistant to wear a shock collar that goes off whenever he disobeys him. One short has Parker and a goth girl sticking their hands in a deep fryer, destroying them, and then they proceed to eat their fried hands. Another episode has a girl's nose falling off thanks to a zit, and then a rat comes and eats her fallen nose. The list goes on, from Parker literally dying of embarrassment to being offered up to a cannibalistic cult, and a frozen body being found in the Mr. Meaty freezers. Just, what the hell was this show? The series ran from 2005 until 2009, so it didn't really have an insanely short lifespan like you might think. Many people seem to remember the show because it was so weird and uncanny, not because of the humor or anything like that. But when you're making a puppet show about meat, it seems inevitable that this would happen.
Chartzufim. From 1996 to 2001, an Israeli political satire show titled Chartzufim aired featuring, you guessed it, disturbing and creepy puppets. Interestingly, most of the puppets were modeled after real politicians, so it's easy to see how the transition from realistic humans to satirical puppets could lead into the uncanny valley. Information about the show in English is rather scarce, so we'll be basing all this information on the few videos present on YouTube. Now, I'm sure you've seen those creepy, realistic Trump and Obama masks at Halloween stores, right? Well, this show is chock full of them for Israeli politicians, with incredibly flabby skin, realistic lips, hair, and just wrong movement. It's essentially as if a political cartoon from The New Yorker came to life, but nobody stopped to think how these exaggerated features would look in the real world before they created them. The result is a jiggly, flabby mess, which, to be fair, is a pretty accurate representation of the elderly real-life politicians they're based off of.
Torchy the Battery Boy. What can one expect when they hear a show title like Torchy the Battery Boy? Especially after knowing that it's a puppet show from the 60s. The British children's show follows the titular Torchy, who indeed has a battery inside of him, along with a lamp on his head. His eyes appear malevolent and bug-eyed, and the static nature of his face doesn't do much to help. Given that this is a marionette show from the 60s, it's clear that the production values weren't too high. The black and white presentation, as well as the staticky audio, add to the uncomfortable nature of the series and puppets. There's a shot at the end of the first episode where Torchy turns his head to say goodbye to an old man.
Be careful, Torchy!
Bye-bye, Mr. Bumbledrop!
His head turn is very unnatural in this shot, and added in with the shadows, low lighting, and generally upsetting face, it proves to be the defining shot of the series. Something innocent that was seen as something far more sinister. The Remini Riddle. The Remini Riddle was an Irish puppet show that aired from 1992 until 1995 and lasted for 3 seasons during a block called Saturday Club. Not much is known about the show given that it has remained almost entirely lost since its finishing airing in 1995. No home media or internet upload have been released, with only 2 short clips surfacing in the past 23 years. The only information about the show comes from these 2 clips, TV guides describing the show, and memories of the viewers. Apparently the show was about 3 orphans who live in the Remini house and try to solve a mystery about 2 girls who drowned many years ago. There's apparently a stuffed otter toy named Otto who is evil and might have had a part in the drowning of the girls. As is tradition, the puppets are horrifying. Their faces are horribly disfigured, as though they went through some kind of terrible accident with hair like Carrot Top. In addition to the human puppets, other creatures appear throughout the series, or at least in the clips that are available, that appear like deformed Fraggles, complete with huge, burning eyes.
It's the middle of the night.
I know it is. You were having a nightmare.
You can say that again.
It's unclear if the show was meant for children, but given its dark and disturbing themes, it's safe to say that it was along the same lines as something like Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Sara and Hoppity. Sara and Hoppity aired in the early 60s and focused on a young girl named Sara and her toy named Hoppity, who is very naughty and gets her into trouble all the time. Given that Sara is a human, you would expect that she would be played by a human, but instead she's a puppet like everyone else. The show features marionettes which are rather stilted and restricted in their movement. In the first episode, Sara is managing the front desk of her mother's toy hospital when an old man wanders in, and nobody sees or hears this man come in, aside from Sara. He claims he has a toy to sell, and then pulls out a broken, dead-looking toy out of a sack, almost like a body bag.
I tell you, there's no one more clever than Hoppity.
Hoppity? Oh, what a lovely name. Why do you call him that?
Because he's only got one leg and he can't dance properly. All he can do is to go hop, hop, Hoppity.
Hot, Hoppity. Oh, how funny. I'll show him to Daddy and see if he'll buy him for me.
Yes, but don't be long. I haven't got all day.
After buying it, Sara cleans him and gives him a new leg, causing the thing to come to life and dance around. And while he's charming at first, Hoppity slowly becomes more mischievous, acting as a sort of demon on Sara's shoulders, convincing her to do bad things. Only she can hear him as well, and when she gets blamed for something bad, she says, "Hoppity told me to do it." It's unknown if Hoppity suggested more and more evil things, given that almost the entire series is currently missing.
Peppermint Park.
Boys and girls, here's something you can do when you can't go to the park. Or maybe your friends can't come over to play. You could ask your mom to get some bubble liquid. And you can make some bubbles like this. Watch. Whee!
Whoa, look
Oh.
at mine. Mine's pretty.
Yeah,
All the
that's
colors and
great.
everything.
Oh, look.
Much like Sesame Street, to which it's often compared, Peppermint Park has a mixture of live action, animation, and puppets. Now, taking one look at this show, it's clear that nobody stopped for a moment to consider that this show was for children, and that they would find these puppets absolutely horrifying. Seriously, these are some of the more disturbing and ugly puppets that we've seen on this list. These puppets feature a talking head with two hands that have real human hands inside of them. They always stare straight forward at the screen, almost as if they're staring at you, the viewer. Often with very awkward and slurred voice acting.
Come on, gang. Sing the song along with me this time. It's marvelous, magnificent. I can't imagine life without the letter M.
The entire show is a mix between a nightmare and a burning trash fire. Despite its relative obscurity, the show has gained a cult following over the past years, thanks to its meme and shitpost potential. You would think that adding funny music and editing the clips into YouTube poops would diminish its creepy nature. But, nah, not really.